I mean, essentially what we've heard from at least the Saudi delegation so far, I mean, they just spent 3 days in Egypt, some historic visit by the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia to Egypt. He met with not just President Sisi, but also, of course, the head of the Coptic Christian faith as well. This is a historic visit for him as well, coming here. They've rolled out the red carpet for him. As you mentioned, he is going to be here later today at Buckingham Palace. He's going to be meeting with Her Majesty the Queen. He's also going to meet with other members of the royal family before heading to Downing Street. Now, of course, what we know so far is that there is a potential for as much as $100 billion of investment between these two countries over the next 10 years when it comes to security as well. They want to work with this UK-Saudi initiative in terms of trying to put together a bigger plan going forward to work together. But of course, this is all on the heels of $1.1 billion in weapon sales from the UK to Saudi Arabia last year in 2017. And also, of course, looking forward in terms of what UK companies can expect to get on the ground in Saudi Arabia. And really this speaks to what is quite an extraordinary move over the last couple of years from Saudi Arabia in terms of taking on their own foreign policy and really trying to use that as also a form of economic diplomacy as well.
Yeah, and aside from the economics, and we know, look, the British arms industry and other industries desperate to sell to the Saudis as well, and will encounter rivals in France, of course, and indeed in the United States. But what about the political side of things as well, Hadley? We know that the administration appears to be backing a more progressive, more activist foreign policy in the region for Saudi Arabia, but it's a harder sell to the British and the Europeans, isn't it?
It seems to be, but at the end of the day, I mean, this is the question, right? What they've done has been rather brilliant in terms of these economic ties. You've got the Aramco IPO, the speculation whether or not they could list in New York or the UK, for example. You've also got a lot of buzz surrounding the opportunities for investment, not just in this $500 billion megacity that's going to be on the Red Sea, but also in terms of just investment in the region's largest economy, which of course is Saudi Arabia. And then you also have a lot of questions over whether or not, there's a feeling of disquiet, as you mentioned, in terms of what Saudi Arabia is doing in the region with this sort of Saudi versus Iran narrative. But by getting, institutional investors involved, by getting governments involved here, they've really basically made it impossible for the Saudi state to fail in a way, at least under the current leadership, because you've got people really buying in. They're buying Saudi debt. They're buying in to Aramco potentially. They're buying in to this narrative that the Crown Prince is really trying to sell here in the UK, which is that we are essential to the stability of the region.
Hadley, can I just take you back to the relationship with the United States? Because it seems to me this is one relationship that we're all struggling to understand how it's shifting. Obviously, the Saudi government has rekindled the relationship with Russia of late for a number of important strategic reasons. We now have this trip to the UK, which ostensibly suggests the UK may get a bit of action on the Aramco IPO, or at least it deepens the ties between these two countries. Is there a subtle shift going on in the power relationship between Saudi and America?
I think that's been going on for several years now. I mean, certainly since Barack Obama announced his famous pivot to Asia. I was sitting in a room with several Saudi and Gulf ministers generally, and there was this feeling of panic because it was the first time in the history of the modern kingdom of Saudi Arabia and these other Gulf countries that they would really have to fend for themselves in terms of foreign policy. And they've been rather brilliant at what they've done, first with Aramco, but also in terms of just shifting those economic ties, as you mentioned, China, Russia, really finding new strategic partners. And I think that if you look at what's happening with the Trump administration, they've been pretty accepting of that, at least so far. I mean, his first state visit as president of the United States was to Saudi Arabia, and they understand that those ties are going to continue to deepen in terms of the economic diplomacy, but also in terms of weapons sales as well, because I think that there is a definite shift regionally, at least, in the knowledge that they're going to have to look elsewhere for these strategic partnerships going forward, because they cannot depend on the United States to have their back at all times. But at the same time, there seems to be a great deal of buzz about the possibility for infrastructure development between Saudi Arabia and the United States. Saudi Arabia looking, of course, to make a profit and looking to invest in what President Trump is trying to do in the U.S. So I think that, it's a multi-layered relationship at this point, certainly with what's happening with the blockade of Qatar, for example. We've heard that there may be some loosening up of that blockade in the coming months, and that certainly the ties to the UAE specifically and ties to Saudi Arabia, I mean, it only is to the benefit for Qatar to really return to the fold. And there's been a lot of disagreement in Washington behind closed doors about how quickly that could take place. But in terms of the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia, I think there is a deep understanding that unless the United States is willing to get more heavily involved in Syria, to get more heavily involved in Yemen, to get more heavily involved in what's happening in Libya, that they're going to really have to take a back seat when it comes to what Saudi Arabia is going to have to do to fend for itself.
Still watching? Perfect. click here to watch another great video from CNBC International. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.